Justin is the co-founder and leader of the AND campaign, which is a Christian civic organization doing tremendous work nationally to equip Christians to have a faithful public witness that's rooted in truth and love. I'm not going to introduce him too long because he might want to share his own story, but would you join me in welcoming Justin Giboney?
So I have heard that y'all have been here for a while, so I won't be before you too long. But I do want to rush to thank just this conference, to thank the hosts for the invitation. This is actually the first time I've stayed in Oklahoma City, so it is a blessing to be before you today, but thank you for the invitation. And also thank Eric for those words. I think those principles that he gave us are very valuable. They don't have to be super complicated. In this moment, those values are really important. So I hope we take those with us. And one of the things that I've worried about a little bit in this moment, for myself, and for those around me, was that sometimes when you are so clear that your political and cultural opposition are wrong, you can forget to look at yourself. Sometimes when it's so clear that the people you're fighting against are very wrong and doing bad things, you can kind of load all your other problems onto them in a way that doesn't make you have to face them. And so one of my hopes for the church is that we would avoid doing that we would have the ability to resist in ways that we need to resist, but also to look at ourselves and how we hurt those around us. A lot of times when we say, I can't believe somebody would do that, well, sometimes, we can't believe that somebody that's far away from us would do something to us, somebody that doesn't know us, but look at what we do to each other, to people that we do know, the injustices we do to our family and things of that nature. So just something to keep in mind. I want to come today from Exodus chapter 1, verses 6 through 11. Exodus chapter 1, verse 6 through 11, if you don't mind. Now Joseph and all his brothers and all that generation died, but the Israelites were exceedingly fruitful. They multiplied greatly, increased in numbers, and became so numerous that the land was filled with them. Then a new king, to whom Joseph meant nothing, came to power in Egypt. Look, he said to the people, the Israelites have become far too numerous for us. Come, we must deal shrewdly with them, or they will become even more numerous, and if war breaks out, we'll join with our enemies, fight against us, and leave the country. So they put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramses as store cities for Pharaoh. I want to start this off with a personal story, if you don't mind. My father, I'm from Denver, Colorado. My father worked for the Denver Water Department for 30 years. And when my father was promoted from being a meter reader, literally a person that goes in your yard and checks your meter, he was promoted from being a meter reader into an office job. He was confronted with some resistance. What I mean is not everybody was welcoming or excited about his prospects. In fact, the lady training him seemed determined to make his transition as difficult as possible, to complicate things and to trip him up, as to prove to him and others that he didn't belong. And in one instance, when he politely questioned an inconsistency in her instruction, she became irate, screaming obscenities and questioning his intelligence. It became clear that this was more than just a misunderstanding. Something deeper and more antagonistic was at play here. Well, the tirade would climax with a physical assault. Swinging an open hand, she would literally slap my father in his face as he sat at his cubicle. Stunned and disoriented, this man from the ghetto of West Side Chicago somehow found the self-restraint to walk away. After all, he had a young family to feed. He would eventually collect himself and do what he was supposed to do via protocol and go to HR. But they had already been tipped off. And predictably, the power structure began to systematically form around the perpetrator to protect its own. And so he was given a half-hearted hearing where a panel void of his peers gaslit him and suggested that he was ungrateful for the opportunity he had so generously been given. In other words, know your place. He would have no internal recourse. You see, the policies in place to prevent such an indignity lacked effect because those who were supposed to administer them lacked integrity. But perhaps to some extent, we're all inclined to choose partiality over just outcomes that would hold our kinsmen accountable. Nevertheless, silenced and indignant, he decided to go to the office of State Senator Regis Groff, Colorado's second black state senator, a civil servant in the truest sense of the word. He recounted his story to the senator, and as my father's representative, Groff went to the office and held those in power accountable for what they had done. Now, I'm certain that he had other things on his calendar that day. He could have spent his time calling donors or dining with power brokers. There were no cameras, no compensation, no awards or any recognition involved. And my father did not have any big campaign contributions to offer. He didn't have any political or social capital to barter. There was no influence to peddle, and it wasn't in the senator's formal job description. But Regis Groff did it because it was right, because he was a sworn representative of the people and had dedicated his life to advocating for the common man. And if truth be told, I probably would not be standing before you today if he had not taken the time to restore a sense of dignity in a man who had been mistreated and was struggling with alcoholism. A young man wondering if he had what it took to be a good father. Trying to break cycles of fatherlessness, succeeding and failing and succeeding to overcome the obstacles and temptations of the society around him. Facing struggles of his own making and those of an institutional origin. That advocate didn't just bless one man that day. He blessed an entire family for generations. And if you think about it, isn't that story a testament to the genius of democracy? Isn't it an illustration of the brilliance of our constitutional republic? The idea that even the smallest among us deserves a voice and an advocate. The wisdom to understand that none of us, no individual and no group, are fit to lord over others without the checks and balances of equal representation. What an exceptional idea. If we go back to Exodus 1, we see what happens when a people is completely without a voice. You see, when Joseph was alive, the Hebrew people were treated fairly. They were allowed to flourish and be fruitful. And this is because those in authority recognized the contribution and respected Joseph. Consequently, his people had an influential advocate. But when Joseph died and a new king to whom Joseph meant nothing stepped in, the Hebrews became nothing more than a threat. Political abstractions, markers on a war room strategy map. From Pharaoh's perspective, the destinies of the Egyptians and the Hebrews were not tied together. in some, the Hebrews were no longer seen as neighbors. And to some extent, isn't that how we see our cultural and political opposition? Simply as people to be defeated and treated harshly. We pretend that the state or the nation would be nearly perfect if we could just get rid of all those progressives or all those conservatives. But isn't that the same root of detachment, self-interest, and contempt that the new king had introduced? When we read Exodus, we often do so from the perspective of the Hebrews. But I would submit that we all have some Pharaoh in us too. And the more we ignore it, the more we risk our power becoming our condemnation. The more our arrogance can turn us into exactly what we think we're fighting against. This is what I call the tyrant impulse. It's the temptation in every group and in every moment to silence or erase others, to unduly prevent them from pursuing different cultural or political ends. It's the urge not to win the debate, but to summarily end the debate through intimidation and force. The tyrant impulse, a tyrant is usually thought of as an individual authoritarian. But I believe it can also be a collective ideological tyrant, urging the state to do its bidding and punish its enemies. Those acting on the tyrant impulse can't tolerate political, social, or cultural disagreement. Our ideologies can be tyrannical when they convince us that we're so right that we shouldn't have to explain ourselves or endure opposition. The impulse is in all of us. The question is whether or not we act on it. And those who don't deliberately extinguish the tyrant impulse in their camp rarely see themselves for what they become, especially if they're upholding what they honestly deem to be a good cause. But I warn you, it is a misreading of history to say that what all tyrants have in common is an obviously malicious cause. Surely some do. That's not the common trait. Some tyrants have championed what were initially good causes. What's common among tyrants is not equal malevolence of cause, but the willingness to violate the human dignity of others to achieve their objectives. The willingness to promote narratives that make other groups appear to lack value and be unworthy of respect. A desire to crush institutions that amplify and give agency to others. Under the tyrant impulse, we can't just say you're wrong and let me show you why. We have to say you're irredeemable and you have nothing at all to contribute. Those who succumb to the tyrant impulse, and we just heard this, have fallen for the age-old error of becoming evil to fight evil. Just because you're fighting evil does not mean that you're right. Just because your opposition is wrong, it does not mean that you're right. The tyrant impulse relies on compulsion instead of persuasion. So it's obviously incompatible with democracy. But it's even more so in conflict with the gospel. Humility, respect, empathy, and intellectual honesty dismantle the tyrant impulse. In the public square, we must decide whether we will be tyrants or neighbors and advocates. If it's possible, as far as it depends on you, live at peace with everyone. We ought to be peacemakers, and we ought to take that task seriously, while understanding that even peacemaking can involve disagreement and friction. I would be doing you a disservice by coming up here and giving you a flowery message, pretending that we can all just agree, sing kumbaya, and live happily ever after. That's not realistic. There will be necessary conflict and tension when we have fundamental disagreements on life and death issues. As Christians, we cannot condone injustice or immorality to achieve some type of fraudulent peace. And so this isn't an ode to moral relativism or kind of a romantic false equivalence. All opinions are not equal. Some are wrong and dangerous. I cannot tell you to silence your convictions in that regard. There are people and groups that must be held accountable, movements that must be vocally opposed, and there are ideas that deserve a very public and democratic death. What I'm saying is that even when we're in conflict, we still have to listen to others and refrain from trivializing their pain. You can be against MAGA or for MAGA, but if you don't care about the drug overdoses and deaths and despair in that community, you're not being a faithful Christian. What I'm saying is that when in conflict, we must be able to still see the person. Because as Alexander Solzhenitsyn once said, the line between good and evil runs not through states, nor through classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart. Your heart, my heart. We got to be honest about that. See, we tend to overestimate our rightness and our righteousness. But the gospel gives us every reason to walk humbly in the public square. Understanding that not all our opinions are faithful biblical applications, but some of them are faulty conclusions, perverted by self-interest, perverted by blind spots. There are issues that the Bible addresses directly and clearly, and consequently, we can confront them with a level of certainty, but we can never confront them with self-righteous arrogance. Jesus continually chastised those who, like the praying Pharisee, exalt themselves while condemning others. And as I read the Bible, I see no indication that God's own people ever had all the answers or a monopoly on good ideas and good works. They were often blessed by the insights of outsiders and sickened by the fruit of their own understanding. God gave us the word, but he did not give any one group all the answers. We're broken. Our intellect is incomplete and can lead to destruction. Even our concept of love is distorted. Think about it. Love for our own has often been treated as a justification for wickedness towards others. As leaders, we must reckon with our partiality and fear what it could do to those under our authority who don't have an advocate in our lives, who we don't see as neighbors. We must rid ourselves of the false and arrogant notion that we or our ideological tribe are intellectual enough or altruistic enough to rule over others without their contribution. History disproves that proposition. Now, I'm not going to name any names, but there are some here today who are from an ideological tradition that oppose the civil rights movement. There are probably others here today who come from an ideological tradition that ushered in eugenics. Conservatism has yet to present us with a perfect meritocracy. Progressivism has yet to prove that replacing God with autonomy can create a perfect utopia. What I'm trying to say is that neither has proof of concept. We seek near absolute power for one side, but the truth is none of us are fit to steward it. And so I would ask everyone here today to think about, what group do I impact, whether I agree with their politics or their ideology or not, that doesn't have an advocate in my life? And how could that cause me to sin against them? To see them as political abstractions? To see them as somebody that I can use and just defeat and throw away? In these moments, I see too many Christians acting like Christian convictions and Christian principles don't apply because things are so bad right now. As if those principles even matter until it gets this bad. That's what they're there for. If you're supposed to love your neighbor and everyone is your neighbor, you have to do it now. You have to be able to see their humanity now. Old gospel hymns and old-fashioned spirituals can serve as much-needed reminders of the foundational principles that we never needed an advanced degree to interpret or understand. You know those old songs, if you listen to them, they provide a lot of good principles. The truths that are sometimes barely visible from ivory towers can be glaringly obvious and instructive in the lowlands of our humility. Now, these old songs were often tirelessly repetitive, but not vainly repetitive. They drove home the point. They may not have appealed to sophisticated sensibilities, but they always made an appeal to the Holy Spirit. They provided us with the ethic and the type of moral imagination that convinced civil rights leaders to march through Jim Crow jurisdiction without sword or self-loathing. I'm talking about lyrics like "Keep Your Eyes on the Prize," which is an adaptation of "Keep Your Hand on the Plow." This song spoke of perseverance and how God's promises liberate us from being enslaved by the threats and the trials of the moment. I'm talking about songs like "Ain't Gonna Let Nobody Turn Me Around," and "I woke up this morning with my mind stayed on Jesus, with my mind stayed on freedom." These songs spoke of the resolve to stay on task and to overcome major and minor setbacks while centering Jesus in our every interaction. Another song continually repeats, "I'm going to treat everybody right until I die." How simple, yet profound when you consider the fact that they weren't just talking about people who blessed them. They were talking about people who lynched them and bombed their churches. That song, if you think about it, is a penetrating exposition about how those who are committed to seeing the human dignity in everyone will somehow find the image of God in the most hostile manifestations of human brokenness. That's what Jesus gives the Christian the ability to do. It speaks to how the only way to see God in someone who hates you is to see what's invisible outside of faith. You have to want to see it. Sometimes you have to be willing to imagine it in spite of all behavior and all other indications. You've got to want to see the dignity in people who mistreat you. That's what Christianity does. It's the difference between wanting vengeance and wanting redemption. And in this moment, every Christian must ask themselves, do we just want vengeance? Do we just want an exchange of power? Or do we want redemption? Because power will and can change hands. It doesn't mean the situation gets any better. And so we really have to look at the ideologies that we're following, the influencers that we hear talking to us. If somebody is always keeping you in a rage, you need to stop following them. Because when you're enraged, you cannot be strategic. You cannot be thoughtful. When you're enraged, you cannot love your neighbor. And we cannot follow the greatest commandment if we don't see people instead of political abstractions. Thank you so much for having me. I appreciate it.